From Thomas Grasso's angry complaint about missing SpaghettiOs to Victor Feguer's chilling request for a single olive with the pit, or Lawrence Brewer's extravagant meal that went completely untouched, these last wishes challenge our understanding of what a person values in their final moments. Whether it's leaving a mysterious message, refusing a meal, or choosing to escape into a fantasy world like Ronnie Lee Gardner, these strange requests show how complex the human mind remains, even in the face of death. Gary Carl Simmons Jr. In Mississippi in 1996, Simmons was found guilty of murdering Jeffrey Wolf. A butcher by trade, he had carefully plotted Jeffrey Wolf's demise. Simmons, his girlfriend, Teresa May, and a few others invited Wolf to Simmons' house in order to settle a drug transaction. He shot and cut Wolf into pieces, which he later discarded in a bayou. The horrendous nature of the crime, coupled with the methodical way in which Simmons carried out his plans, removed any doubt of the violent tendencies of his character. The same gruesome incident brought about Simmons' death sentence in 1997, which maintained several years of petitions in the courts. The developments preceding his execution, however, engaged more attention to Simmons for different reasons. Very quickly, the absurdly large final meal order, his last meal request, came first to the newspapers. Striking at an astounding 29,000 calories, the order featured Pizza Hut's infamous Super Supreme Pizza with extra toppings, 10 ranch dressings, a family Doritos bag, 8 ounces of nacho cheese with jalapenos, 4 fried pork chops, 2 large cups of strawberry milkshake, 2 pints of vanilla ice cream, and a 2-liter root beer. Eating and drinking such enormous food and liquids seemed so unrealistic that many were fascinated with, and others criticized, the idea. Some took that wish as an illustration of the man's obsession and the need to dominate everything, even in the last hours of his life. Philip Workman. The remarkable request made prior to his death would act not only for Philip's benefit. Philip Workman was sentenced to death for murdering a policeman in the course of a robbery gone wrong in Memphis, Tennessee in 1981. He spent over 20 years on death row, where his case remained highly controversial. The troubled life of Philip Workman has been marked by an unending battle with drugs, mental illness, and the effects, as he argued, of that night. He was certain that he was not a murderer and that the poor cop was shot by someone else, even though he could possibly have fired his own gun. The jury, however, found him guilty as charged and sentenced him to death, a verdict that ceaselessly elicited outrage from his supporters. Workman's last days were marked with a surprising final wish, especially for someone in his situation. Instead of asking for one last meal for himself, Philip requested that a vegetarian pizza be given to a nearby homeless person. This request was unique and particularly touching, given that most last meal requests involve tempting, comfort, or nostalgic-type foods. However, such a simple wish to put food in the belly of someone who is hungry was also denied by prison officials who said they could not bring such a request to fruition due to practical concerns. Yet despite this refusal, Workman's desire was not unacknowledged. People across Tennessee and beyond began ordering pizzas for homeless shelters, fulfilling his wish in spirit, if not in execution. The gesture quickly grew into a movement, with donations flowing to shelters in honor of Workman's final request. Alan Lee "Tiny" Davis. Florida witnessed the case of a convicted murderer whose savage deeds made him a household name, and so did the critical issues surrounding his death. Nathan, not the cabbie, was a mass murderer responsible for the 1982 slaying of Nancy Wheeler, her 2 little girls, and himself, and weighed 350 pounds. The difference in his health pictures cannot be understated. This horrific crime shook the state and the world in general, resulting in a massive wave of sorrow and rage. In the few days before his final sentence, the individual requested a last dinner whose imageries appeared to indulge in pleasures and philosophies of extreme cleanliness. He ordered a lobster tail, fried prawns, wedges, half a garlic bread loaf, and a big beverage. The excessiveness of his choice, however, was not the only thing that was striking. Davis had gone to the great lengths of specifying every detail of his meal to the extent that had bordered on the obsessive. From how the lobster should be cooked, all seasonings included on the shrimp, to the delectables of such noodles, everything was put across in detail, rendering a last meal like no other. Angel Nieves Diaz. Angel Nieves Diaz, confined to death row in a Floridian penitentiary as a Puerto Rican national, made a final judgment that appeared to counter not only his pronouncement but also the ceremonies that accompanied it. Diaz was found guilty of participation in the murder associated with the robbery that took place in Miami in 1979 and resulted in the killing of a bar's manager. He claimed his innocence and was sentenced to death, with his efforts proving futile. He and his attorney argued that his convict was indeed built on flimsy evidence and dubious attestations. By the time the year to execute him came, it was 2006. Diaz had already been a patron saint for many who are hesitant to believe the fairness of the justice system, and the scandals surrounding his situation were well documented. In what would call a startling act, Diaz made no application for the final breakfast. Most inmates of death row consist of elaborate and often sentimental last meals. However, he requested none, not even the ordinary meal provided to all inmates. Even though this act was quiet, it seemed more powerful and meaningful because it is obvious that Diaz would not wish to engage in activities which are normal human practices and are designed for those on sanction to the last day. Robert Alton Harris. He was sentenced to death for killing someone, and he was executed in California, but he is better known for his luxurious Last Supper and the drama that came with it. Harris was imprisoned for life for murdering 2 teenage boys in 1978, a case that shocked and traumatized the families of the 2 victims. His crime was grotesque in nature. He, along with an accomplice, had hijacked a vehicle apparently to commit a bank heist and in the course of events snatched 2 young men, drove them hundreds of miles away, and executed them. Such an act would result in a conviction that would eventually lead Harris to the gas chamber after countless appeals and years of legal fights. On the date of his execution in the year 1992, Harris made a final meal request that was rather extravagant and almost akin to a feast, something that certainly would be at odds with the nature of the situation. He ordered a 21-piece of bucket chicken from Kentucky Fried Chicken, 2 large pizzas, ice cream, and a 6-pack of Pepsi. To those who cooked and saw the last meal served to him, the spread was a chilling contrast to the shocking acts that he committed. How strange the grandeur of the meal request was, how extreme and even offensive, like someone decided to honor a festive occasion instead of a noose. Moments ahead of his demise, Harris spoke a line that would breathe life into his last moments. They were the lines from the movie Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey of 1991.
You might be a king or a little street sweeper, but sooner or later you dance with the Reaper.
The statement reverberated within the room during his final moments, causing a deep darkening of these last seconds and a discomfort among those present. It was like he wanted to make a horrid show out of the few seconds left for him to live, welcoming death with arms wide open, but not in a manner one would wish to seek solace. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy remains one of the most dreadful criminals in the history of the United States, and there is no question that he was a serial killer. This man was convicted of killing 33 men, boys, and young adults in the state of Illinois between the years 1972 and 1978, and needless to say, he was a monster. Gacy's case was unique in the sense that it went beyond ordinary crimes due to Gacy's vicious habits and secret life. During the day, Gacy was a clean, healthy, and active member of the community who helped organize occasions and even dress himself as Funny Pogo the Clown. Yet each night, he would stalk young boys, inviting them to visit and then torturing them in his home. Most, not all, of Gacy's victims ended up stashed in between the walls of his home in a crawlspace, and that detail horrified a nation when his crimes were unveiled. The arrest of Gacy boys in 1978 sparked off a trial which was the subject of many newspaper articles. The publication of information about his crimes during the trial only solidified the image of Gacy as a callous killer. He was sentenced to death in 1980 following conviction and spent over 10 years on death row as various appeals and other legal measures created a stay of execution. While in jail, Gacy showed almost no guilt, even going as far as claiming to be abused by the very system he had been sentenced by. Many were unsettled by the haughty and brutal stance he held throughout his imprisonment, resolved to not show any kind of pity until the very end. He requested a KFC bucket meal, French fries, a dozen battered shrimp, and a pound of strawberries. Even before he was apprehended, Gacy had been operating 3 units of KFC, and the fact that he ordered fried chicken goes back to many parts of his life wherein he was living a normal existence. For many people, it was disturbing to him to have made a request for a meal that he used to consume as a fast food manager during his final days, because it was rather mundane than the rest of his life that had been full of horrible experiences. Odell Barnes Jr. Odell Barnes Jr. is another Texas convict whose notoriety does not branch out only to the murder of which he was sentenced to punishment, but also to his last request, which was melancholic and quite disturbing. In 2000, Barnes was sentenced to death for the murder of an old lady, which he has never admitted to. His conviction was full of inconsistencies and raised concerns on the effectiveness of the trial and the defense provided. As it was getting nearer to the date when Barnes could be executed, he chose to speak out the words that would be heard beyond the prison walls, even in the spirit of his last minutes. As his execution date approached, Barnes used his final moments to make a statement that would resonate far beyond the confines of the prison walls. Instead of asking for a last meal, a request that typically ranges from extravagant to sentimental, Barnes made an unusual appeal for justice, equality, and world peace. This extraordinary decision he made, in a way, expressed his disappointment and anger at a justice delivery system, which he capitalized on, believing let him down. On the contrary, by choosing ideals over physical needs, in this case, food, Barnes transformed his last request to one that was critical not only of his situation, but the society at large. Velma Barfield. The significance of Velma Barfield in the history of crime in America cannot be overemphasized, since she was the first woman to face death in the United States after the imposition of the death penalty by the Supreme Court in 1976. She poisoned her victims with arsenic, where she was charged for murder, but even more scandalously, included her own mother in years of committing crimes of ever-growing viciousness. Before her arrest in 1978, Barfield had developed a reputation as a kind caregiver who normally housed and cared for the needy. Nevertheless, this deep-seated compassion harbored a woman who was very troubled and dealing with demons of addiction and mental illness. Velma's trial was defined by the graphic nature of her offenses and the damning evidence of her guilt. Even with the prosecution showing her poisoning evidence, she portrayed a picture of a woman who was very maternal, but her love could be dangerously cruel. In 1984, when the execution date neared, Velma ordered a Coca-Cola and a pack of cheese doodles. The sheer mundaneness of this rather innocent selection unsettled everyone as she nonchalantly munched on her snack. This straightforward request raised questions regarding her psychological disposition in her last hours. Was it that she craved the taste of something that had happier memories attached to them? Or was this a show of acceptance of her situation, an acceptance of the life that she had lived and the decisions she made? Victor Feguer. Executed in Iowa in 1963 for the murder of a businessman during a robbery, Feguer's life had been marked by a series of poor choices that led him down a dark path. After committing the crime, he was apprehended, tried, and ultimately sentenced to death, becoming a figure in a contentious debate about the morality of capital punishment. As his execution approached, Feguer's last meal request stood out for its striking simplicity and profound symbolism. He asked for a single olive with the pit intact. This seemingly peculiar choice was layered with meaning, as Feguer explained that he hoped an olive tree would grow from his grave. The olive tree has long been a symbol of peace and reconciliation, and Feguer's request reflected a poignant desire for harmony even in the face of his impending death. His choice resonated with the idea that life can continue beyond one's physical existence, a wish for a legacy of peace rather than violence. Ronnie Lee Gardner. Ronnie was convicted in 1984 for the murder of a bartender during a robbery. After a long and tumultuous journey through the criminal justice system, he was sentenced to death in Utah, becoming yet another figure in the ongoing debate about capital punishment. As his execution date approached in 2010, Gardner's final meal request was known for its opulence, but also for the unusual way he chose to spend his last hours. He requested a sumptuous feast that included lobster tail, steak, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream. Yet, it was not just the food that captured attention. Gardner also asked to watch the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy during his final hours. Some observers noted that it seemed almost like an attempt to grasp onto life one last time, to savor pleasure and joy in the face of inevitable doom. The food, rich and indulgent, mirrored his desire to celebrate life's fleeting pleasures, while the film served as a temporary sanctuary from the grim reality awaiting him. In a way, Gardner's final hours became a personal statement. Lawrence Russell Brewer. He is perhaps one of the most infamous figures in the discussion of last meal requests, not just for his heinous crime, but for the sheer extravagance of his final meal order. Convicted of a racially motivated murder in Texas, Brewer was sentenced to death for his involvement in the brutal killing of James Byrd Jr., an African-American man. This crime shocked the nation not only for its brutality, but also for its clear representation of hate and racism. Brewer's actions were reflective of deep societal issues, and his trial brought attention to the ongoing struggle against hate crimes in America. As his execution approached in September of 2011, Brewer's last meal request became the subject of significant controversy. He ordered an astonishing array of food that included 2 chicken fried steaks smothered in gravy, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, fried okra, a pound of barbecue, and several other items and desserts. The excessive nature of his request drew attention and criticism, especially in light of the serious crimes he had committed. It felt as if he was not only indulging in culinary excess, but also sending a message of defiance against the very system that condemned him. However, Brewer famously left his entire meal untouched. This act of rejection was perceived as a final act of rebellion, a way to thumb his nose at the state and the system. Teresa Lewis. Teresa Lewis's case represents a striking contrast to the grandiosity of some final meal requests. One of the few women executed in Virginia, Lewis was convicted of orchestrating the murders of her husband and stepson in a plot to collect on life insurance policies. Her crime, while heinous, brought to light discussions around gender, culpability, and the complexities of criminal justice, especially in cases involving women. When her execution date arrived in 2010, Teresa's last meal request was surprisingly simple and homely. She asked for fried chicken, buttered peas, and a slice of German chocolate cake. This choice was known for its simplicity, but also for the sense of normalcy it involved. In her final hours, Lewis exhibited a calm demeanor, praying and singing hymns as she consumed her meal. The contrast between the severity of her actions and the peacefulness of her final moments created a haunting atmosphere, making her execution one of the most unsettlingly serene on record. And with that, we wrap up the list of strange and unnerving final wishes from death row inmates. These requests, sometimes indulgent, sometimes defiant, and often inexplicably strange, give us an eerie look into the minds of people facing the unthinkable. If you found this dive into the unusual and unsettling as captivating as we did, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more haunting stories from the darker side of history.